Welcome everybody to SciFX. This is class 103. 100 meaning that it's a foundations course, and 3 being the third installment. And we have my wonderful guest Julian XEER from last class back this week to share some more expertise. I want to say hi.
Hey, it's happy to be here. I'm happy to be participating and learning and sharing with you all.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this again. I think it went really well last time. And yeah, this is a very similar and interwoven subject with yoga and meditation, which is what we did last week. And the subtle body is something that is a really crucial thing to understand, along with just the things we talked about last week, which were mostly about practice and discipline, and focus, concentration, just these sort of tenets of any spiritual practice. The subtle body is something that works in tandem with all of those things in order to kind of give you a platform with which you can pretty much progress into any more specialized ability or skill or study. It's going to be really crucial for you to do this development and have the dedication to building the subtle body and understanding it so that you can pursue almost anything. It's going to be the sort of practical part of any kind of, astral projection, remote viewing, medical, intuition, things like that we'll talk about. So what is it? What is the subtle body? Well, what we're going to describe today are the most useful ways that Julie and I have come across to think of it. It's something that has been alluded to in many different languages throughout many different cultures throughout many different years. It has, it's been called, it's very akin to the chakra system, which I think we've all heard about. It's been referred to as, I think, in my opinion, it's almost synonymous with what Taoists call the immortal fetus, the astral body, the etheric body. I think it also has a lot to do with what we think of as the aura or the soul as well. So we're going to go deeper into all of the subtle differences between all these images of the subtle body. So all of our reality and our personal existence, as well as our universal existence, really occurs in layers. And a lot of different metaphysical systems have called these layers, stratified them as the physical, being the densest, then the subtle being sort of an overlay on top of that. And there are substrata of the subtle as well. There's the physical, then there's the emotional, the mental, and the soul or the spiritual. But what I wanted to bring into this understanding, this is something that you can really easily Google and find out about in a matter of seconds, but I wanted to bring in some of the more opaque findings of modern science that are absolutely not opposed to actually a lot of these conceptions of the body, even though a lot of people tend to dismiss these types of theories as unscientific or unempirical. The reality is that in quantum physics, we learned that energy and matter are one and the same. And what really creates this sort of disparity between them is it's the condition of the observer. It's the state from which we're actually observing the subject. And so this is really crucial when we think about our subtle senses, which is what we would use to detect or observe the subtle body. to access the subtle senses, most scriptures or metaphysical doctrines will direct you towards just relaxing the mind, meditating, quieting the mind, so that you can basically perceive finer and finer details and allow them to come more clearly into your consciousness. And you do this by meditation, you do this by yoga. And one really interesting example of this is the way that that the U.S. government actually trains agents, in the Central Intelligence Agency or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to detect lies using meditative techniques. This is actually something that has been thoroughly investigated by the U.S. government and military. They not only believe in psychic abilities, they have done thorough research in how to use them and weaponize them, actually. So, all it is when you're detecting lies or when you're doing things like this and going through this type of training is learning things like meditation, learning how to hone in on finer and finer details with your attention to the point that it seems like supernatural ability to people who haven't gone through the same training. So, if the US military is interested in this kind of awareness, then it begs the question, why aren't our healthcare practitioners and our doctors, why isn't this something that we are using as a tool to, heal and empower people rather than as a weapon? Because it really does have so many amazing applications in both realms, if you think about it. I'm not I'm not really going to answer that question because it's a lot. But it's something that we come across often when we are in the healing professions, or when we're interested in things like energy healing, energy medicine, and using yoga and meditation and energy bodies to enact positive change. And it's been a very frustrating point of topic among a lot of people in the field, whether they are herbalists, acupuncturists, homeopathic doctors. Why isn't this more well accepted in the Western medicine community? So there are some texts in the page that I just linked you to, scifx.info/PFX103, the subtle body. One of them is called the Body Electric by Robert Becker, and this is a really, really interesting book that I completely tore up just all yesterday, and it was published in 1998. And it's written by a scientist who went through great lengths to study the effects of electromagnetic stimulation on the regenerative properties of the human body and also amphibian bodies. So he went through a lot of different species and looked at all the different animals that know how to regenerate parts of their bodies that have been amputated or irreparably damaged. And this is just starting with the Hydra, and trying to understand what are the mechanisms behind this regenerative property of life. And he found a lot of different things. There's so many texts that I could refer to that take all of this as a given, but I'm interested in this because this is kind of the front and the main body of work that is currently being used to substantiate things like Chinese medicine in the allopathic or Western medical world today. So in the Body Electric, he described, this is one of the first white people to really legitimize Chinese medicine, because he spoke to this person who was another white guy who was injured in China and had to have an operation, and all that they used as anesthetic on him was acupuncture needles, for a major operation, and he really didn't feel anything. He was so surprised, like, how does this work so well? And then what this scientist realized was that, like, the meridians that are used in this whole map of, channels through the body of chi or electricity or life force, they're not necessarily linked to any of the physiological systems that we, physically are able to observe in Western science. What they are linked to is a biomagnetic field that exists within everything. Like, every living thing has its own energy field, just as the whole earth has its own energy field. And so this person, Becker, went on to talk about how the Chinese have definitely been perfecting this art for thousands of years and using it in their medicine. But he was aware that everyone in his scientific community thought that it was bullshit for whatever reason. So he did what he could to substantiate that claim, and did a lot of research on the electromagnetic fields within human bodies, within the DC current that he saw as he started to use what was new technology in the 60s and 70s, like potentiometers and ways to detect, like, the voltage potential of different tissues and organs and cells within the body, seeing how there is direct current and just a literal electrical flow that was not properly recorded or detected before, that runs through the human body, and that should also be a useful interface for healing. Rather than using biochemistry as the basis of treatment in Western medicine, he talked about how we should use physics. We use physics to do imaging. We use physics to, diagnose problems in Western medicine. But when it comes to treating them, we tend to go towards a pharmaceutical route that does not necessarily work. As time has gone on, we've seen more and more the ways in which the pharmaceutical paradigm of Western medicine has been failing us, especially when it comes to modern diseases that seem like enigmas to us, like Lyme disease or pain management, which are both things that are very well handled in the realm of Chinese medicine. So, all these things were dismissed for so long in the West, and now it's really exciting because I found this journal that was published in 2019 that's also linked there about energy medicine, and it's largely based on the work of Becker in the book The Body Electric. And it talks about how the chakra systems and how the meridian system can be studied as an overlap or an overlay that has a lot to do with the human energetic field, and this field of electromagnetism, of moving poles throughout our bodies and magnetic points and running electricity, in order to basically deepen our understanding of the mind-body connection and to be able to treat patients on a more holistic level and use physics and biophysics as the basis of treatment rather than chemistry. And that this is not only just like a Eastern, ancient Chinese secret type of wisdom thing, it's just based in actual modern science. There's also a really interesting way that they talk about the endocrine system and how, there's a lot of answers there within, like, hormones being sort of this missing link between the physical and the subtle body, because they have so much to do with how we modulate the electromagnetic currents within our body. So yeah, I would really recommend those readings. They're a little bit deep, but if you're really interested in history of science like I am, and you're also into spirituality, it might give you something to chew on. Okay, moving on. I also wanted to talk about Edgar Cayce, who was a really famous medical diagnostician, but he did everything. He was known as the sleeping prophet. So he did most of his work doing readings and being able to give this like really accurate, occult information, but also very, very effective remedies, medical remedies for thousands of people during his life. And he did it while he was asleep. So he would, as he said, like sit down or lay down on his couch in his office, untie his shoelaces, loosen his tie, loosen his belt, and made sure that all of the circulation in his body was free flowing. And then he would put his hands over his stomach, and he called it his solar plexus, and basically fall asleep. And somebody would be there asking him questions for the client. And this was obviously a type of channeling or astral viewing or something that he was using his own subtle body or his own unconscious to access information that he saw as sort of floating on a plane of the subject's unconscious or the subject's subtle body. Which is not to say that our subtle body is always unconscious, but it generally starts that way just because of the ways that we are socialized to basically dismiss its entire existence. But as we'll see later in the lecture, like there's so many different applications and reasons to start to think of it as real and broaden the awareness of it, broaden the relationship that we have to it, and use it as a vehicle for just a million different things. Towards the end of his life, Cayce was really interested in auras. And he wrote sort of a pamphlet that outlines his system of using colors to read the body. And he wrote this because he didn't realize his whole life that like, he was seeing colors around people, and this was part of his gift, and it was part of how he was able to make his diagnoses and his readings. But he had never realized that not everybody saw those colors and not everybody was perceiving auras in the same way as him. So he finally wrote about it and said that the different colors of the rainbow for him read as different issues or psychological factors or physical factors in that person's health, which is interesting to note because colors are the visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So there's all kinds of different radiation and waves, going from the kilohertz or probably, way more than that. I'm not even sure what the unit of measure is for gamma rays and etc. But then you have things like microwaves, radio waves, ultraviolet waves, infrared waves, and then you have the visible spectrum of light. So yeah, I mean, it's all about vibration. It's all about waves and particles. And colors, as we know, also correlate to the chakras and the 5 elements in Taoism. So this begs the question if an aura is the same as the subtle body, which I think is something that I used to really question. And pretty much until super recently, I didn't know the difference. I mean, I did a lot of work in trying to see auras and trying to understand the subtle body, and I then basically came across this stuff that I've just been talking about with Robert Becker. And what I've come to think is that the aura is less of the actual subtle body and more of it's our perception of the rays that are being emanated from a person. So it really depends on the level of perception, a level of subtlety that you're able to sense, the level of frequencies and wavelengths that you're able to perceive, whether with your eyes or with your subtle senses. And this is actually backed by some of the research in the body electric, which is that there are diodes in the skin. And diodes are, one directional conductors of electricity. So it's possible, the skin actually is radiating rays, waves, and particles of a certain sort that are not visible to the physical eyes. And I think that there are a lot of people who actually do have a certain sense activated within them that they are able to perceive that kind of light emanating from the skin. There's also really interesting historical phenomena. I mean, I don't know if it's historical. I personally believe a lot of it, but it's also regarded as myth and legend. But there have been a lot of yogis and adepts and very highly spiritually accomplished people who have left certain phenomena on this world. I mean, there's also living qigong masters today who have undergone certain tests that show that their bodies are emitting like enormous amounts of different types of rays that don't come from regular people. So spiritual practice really does affect the aura, and you can see that when you start looking at the aura and looking at the energy body or what information it's releasing to you as an indication of the health of the individual. But yeah, there's things like the story of Bodhidharma's face being imprinted. Bodhidharma was the originator of Zen Buddhism, and he was said to have meditated facing a wall for however many months or years until he was able to leave his body. And legend has it that there is a photographic imprint on this wall where he meditated of his face, and you can see it's him because he has a beard. He has like a very distinct face. This is similar to this idea that the Shroud of Turin that was supposedly wrapped around the body of Christ has this imprint on it of what looks like, when you open it up, it looks like the body of Jesus. So it could be that this is all to say that like what the subtle body is, or what the soul is, and what it can do when it leaves the body, or how it's connected to electromagnetic systems and networks that are around us, they are not non-physical, and they're also, which also means because it's generated by the thoughts and so connected to the psyche, it also means that the thoughts and the soul and the psyche have a physical existence as well, and they have physical effects on this world, such as being able to leave to work through photons, to leave imprints that are visible. So there's also a lot that can be said about what building the subtle body and working on it within our lifetime can do for our afterlife. It's very tied in, like it's really impossible to look into the existence of the subtle body without also accepting reincarnation, the idea of an afterlife, the idea of supernatural abilities, and we will continue to go deeper into this subject. But yeah, I wanted to first let Julian take over, because this is where we are going to talk about how to once we accept the existence of the subtle body and kind of have a better idea of how it fits into our reality, what can we do to make contact with it? What can we do to activate it and keep it up? Because just like any of our other bodies, you know, the mental, emotional, spiritual body, energetic body also needs to be maintained, it needs to be exercised and kept up in a certain way. So I'm going to let Julian take over.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was a very excellent sort of foundation around the subtle body and various ways in which it shows up in our world and our spiritual lives. I think first and foremost, on the question of like, what are practical ways in which one can begin to experience the subtle body? Because it's one thing to talk about it, it's one thing to philosophize about it, another thing to prove its existence to yourself. And then what do you do once its existence is proved to you? And I want to bring it back to the foundational practice of yoga and meditation. As I've, within the first line of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I think that's the best and most succinct definition of what yoga is, which is yoga chitta vritti nirod, where yoga is the cessation of the restlessness of the mind. So it's through engaging in certain practices that at first concentrate your awareness and then makes your awareness single pointed, and then later puts you into a state of absorption, that gradually, as the mind becomes more and more calm and more single pointed, it becomes aware of more and more internal subtlety. And so it's through that practice that then, as you go from sitting primarily aware of the gross phenomena of the physical body and its sensations, aches and pains, or points of pleasure, bodily posture, to the more subtle, energetic, sort of sensations of energy, whether it's like tingling sensations, a heatness, a coolness. And this later then develops itself into an awareness of an entire kind of subtle anatomy that overlays the physical body. And then from there, the deeper sort of awareness of the astral or kind of imaginal world, the world of the collective unconscious, then starts to become more and more visible within your awareness. And then eventually causal and non-dual states of consciousness. So consciousness state training through yoga and meditation is a very effective way of gradually developing awareness of the subtle bodies. And it also is a way of learning how to practice good hygiene for these bodies that now you know exist. And it's an excellent way to learn how to nourish and tend to these bodies and see how they play out in your day-to-day life. So there's kind of these dual aspects of study and practice, and the two go hand in hand. That learning about these things, thinking about them, is incredibly important, and then also doing practices that give you the experience of the thing, and then relating what you study to what you experience, and developing a deeper awareness of how this shows up within your day-to-day life. As we were talking about before, there are a lot of applications for energy awareness towards the field of physical health and medicine, and great ways of integrating energy healing techniques to any physical treatment that you're engaging in order to improve results and speed in recovery. I think that that's very much connected to these teachings within the mystical traditions around emanation, that like reality comes from this source, this essential consciousness, and through ever more kind of grosser layers of manifestation, it comes out into the physical world. And so any physical element also has an energetic counterpart, which has a mental and emotional counterpart, which then has a sort of core spiritual dimension to it. And treating illness through multiple dimensions, or treating wellness through multiple dimensions, makes health and healing a lot more effective. I also think that understanding the energy body also changes the way we understand psychology too, and the way that we understand our own minds. Because I think in the West, there's this prevalent view of the mind as this kind of abstract internal space that things just sort of happen inside of. And there's partial truth to that. However, a lot of the yogic traditions have been able to actually map the mind as containing a kind of anatomy that is similar to the anatomy of the physical body. And so you can simultaneously like use the mind to work with the mind, but you can also tangibly touch the fabric of the mind and make changes on it that way. And that fabric of the mind is composed of a type of what my teacher, Magurunath, calls like a sort of fabric of radiant aether, or a type of etheric energy. Um, and so different systems kind of focus on different parts of this subtle body, and it's all incredibly intricate and layered. In the Taoist yoga tradition, for example, this question of the split between the body and mind is kind of reconciled so that you see the body and mind aren't separate. And for example, in Taoist yoga, different internal organs are associated as like the storehouses of different emotions. So for example, the heart and the small intestine are associated with emotions of love, joy, and happiness, but there are also places where hatred, cruelty, and impatience are stored. Similarly, the liver, the eyes, and the gallbladder are associated with emotions of kindness and generosity, but are also storehouses of anger, frustration, jealousy, and envy. The kidneys, the ears, and the bladder are associated with gentleness, calmness, and serenity, but also storehouses of fear. The lungs, the skin, and the large intestine are storehouses of courage and righteousness, but also are storehouses of sadness and depression. And the spleen, stomach, and pancreas facilitates fairness, openness, and a sense of trust, but can also be storehouses of worry, anxiety, and distrust. And this is really important to think about too, as mental and physical health interrelate to each other, because these emotions, these positive emotions, actually benefit the health of those physical organs, and experiencing those negative emotions in excess also damage those organs in the body. So Taoist yogis, observing this, were able to also assign different alchemical designations to these organ systems. Very simply and quickly put, the heart and small intestine were associated with the fire element, the liver, eyes, and gallbladder with the wood element, kidney, ears, and bladder with water, lungs, skin, and large intestine with metal, spleen, stomach, and pancreas with earth. And so what they were able to do is then engage in both practices where you're incorporating consuming foods that are good for particular organs while trying to work through particular emotions, and then also engaging in meditation and energy healing practices where you're concentrating on different organs, applying different colors associated with the alchemical elements, and transmuting the emotional energy in a way that you can engage the body to engage the mind in a very deep way. And that's just on the level of the internal organs. But you also have various meridians, which, or nadis as they call them in yoga. And these meridians or nadis are kind of like the energetic counterpart to the physical nervous system. And there's 72,000 of them in total. I'm not going to go into the names of every single one because that would be super extensive. But some of the major ones that we know about is the Ida and Pingala Nadis, which are known as like the solar and lunar, or the yin and yang sort of nadis that sort of coil like two serpents up and down the spine. Like if you've ever seen the medical symbol, actually the caduceus wand, that's actually a symbol of the spine or the central channel, the Sushumna Nadi, or the governor's channel in the subtle body, and the Ida and Pingala, or yin and yang channels. So it's very interesting that like our symbol for Western medicine is actually a symbol about the energy body, the subtle body, yet these systems don't relate to, they don't like put the two together. But
Yeah, and can I add something?
absolutely.
Well, when I was working with, I worked at a healing center that was sort of a all-encompassing kind of place for Chinese medicine, acupuncturists. And I was also receiving acupuncture from these practitioners. And what they were doing was a specific school of like very kind of traditional Taoist alchemy, which was called 5-element acupuncture. And when I was receiving this treatment, it was very holistic. Like, and not all acupuncturists are like this, I want to add, because acupuncture has become such a vast field, and it's had to, just like all people from, you know, the Eastern cultures, like had to sort of assimilate to a more and more Western, more and more modern world. And now we see a lot of acupuncture schools that are heavily, you know, based in medical science that is benefited and had to keep up with Western diagnostic techniques and modern illnesses. But traditionally, you know, acupuncture and Chinese medicine, it was supposed to be directed at, you know, the emotions and the mental as well. And I was always kind of asked to do talk therapy as a part of acupuncture, because pain, you know, which is so well managed using electromagnetic pulses in acupuncture, is a holographic nature. You know, it's not just a physical phenomenon, it's something that we experience mentally, spiritually, and emotionally as well. So it makes sense that, you know, approaching these things from all of those dimensions is going to have the best effect on all of us. And it also was a style of treatment that really called me to reflect on all the different parts of my being and how they all affected each other, and how anything that manifests basically on the physical level is a progression. It's a progressed manifestation of something that occurs first and foremost in the etheric realm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really key. Like, you know, there is a type of kind of emanation process where things go from subtle to gross, from the energy, from the spiritual to the energetic to the physical. And if you can catch something when it still exists in a subtle level, then you can prevent it from manifesting physically. So there is so much benefit, not just to enhancing healing after a problem has arose, but preventative care too. And it really kind of gives you like a holistic picture of life, because it shows you that it's also by tending to your heart and tending to your emotional needs and tending to your mental life that you also support caring for your physical body. And in the West, we have this very prevalent kind of like body-mind split that shows up not just in the way that we organize our day-to-day lives and the way we move, but also in the way that we think, right? Where the body and mind are seen as separate things. And these have really, really deep implications also to the ways in which like labor is distributed, and the way that like class society and systems of oppression operate too. Because we have these notions of certain people that are seen as leading lives of the flesh, as it were, that people that are like closer to the animal kingdom. And these are also people that were historically sort of cast with having to do like physical manual labor, right? Where then on top of that, you have the kind of like ruling class, or sort of like white master race, or what have you, that gets to lead lives of the mind and do like mental labor on top of the physical labor that society is kind of like built upon. And so this body mind split is very much like, it shows itself up socially as well. And the practices of yoga are really useful for helping us to firstly dissolve the illusionary concept that there is a separation between the body and mind, but also bring the body and mind into greater harmony. There are countless manifestations of body-mind split that shows up in our day-to-day lives. You know, and bringing the two in harmony is a way of allowing your sort of like thoughts, words, and deeds to come into perfect alignment, for your internal dreams and hopes and aspirations to align with your actions in a way that shows up in the world, where you're being the person that you truly want to be. And yoga asana, physical postures, help to deal with that as well. And there are various types of body-mind splits too. The body and mind is kind of a big, broad one, but some other examples are like, for example, the split between the top and the bottom of the body, right? Now, the top of the body is has a lot to do with like seeing, hearing, speaking, thinking, expressing yourself, also with self-expression and self-communication, whereas the bottom part of the body is the part of the body that touches the earth, and it has a lot to do with like stabilizing, moving, balancing, rooting, feeling a sense of comfort and your groundedness in the world, right? So what's the purpose of thinking about these kinds of splits? So it's like different types of emotions are also stored within the body. If you engage in a daily practice of physical yoga postures, you'll start to see that over time, you'll start to have certain cathartic experiences while you're stretching, or you're stretching and then certain thoughts and emotions will start to come to mind. That's because these emotions are stored in these different muscular centers. So for example, with the bottom of the body and the feet and legs, a lot of our emotions around like home and, you know, our home of origin as well as are sensitive, like being firmly planted on the earth, groundedness, all of these other things are stored in this part of the body. Whereas the upper part of the body tends to also deal with, how we're socially received and how we go out into the world to sort of present ourselves, right? Another split is kind of like the front and the back of the body, which kind of goes more on what I was just saying, that the front is kind of like the worldly facing side and the back is kind of like the shadow side or the shadow element. Or like, for example, the torso and the limbs, or the torso is kind of like the core of your sense of self. It really has to do with the self-serving, self-reflecting, self-understanding and protecting parts, where the limbs are associated with like action, right? And the things that you do. The head and the mind is kind of like the conscious and unconscious, right? And there's obviously far more unconscious than there is like conscious ego activity. The conscious and the ego being associated with the neck and head, and the unconscious being associated with the rest of the body. And these are important things to keep in mind too, because in the practice of Hatha Yoga and the practice of doing yoga poses, you're engaging in different poses that benefit these different parts of your mind too. So it is a type of like if you're doing talk therapy, for example, and you're also engaging the energy system, engaging the body in that way, integrates all of these different aspects. And this kind of like takes us also to something called the Sushumna Nadi, or the central channel of the spine, or the governor's channel in Chinese medicine. And this is like the main kind of like nerve, the main psychic nerve, where all the major intersections of all the other nadis or all the other meridians kind of are strung along. So these intersections are known as chakras. And there are 7 total. There's tons of information on the internet about the 7 chakras if you would like to learn more about it. Very briefly, at the root of the spine, you have the Muladhara, or the root chakra. And this has to do with your physical body, your sense of physical survival, all of your conditioning from birth, the physiological, the archaic self. And it has a lot to do with physical body, physical needs, food, clothes, shelter, a need to feel safe, a need to be able to stand up for yourself and defend your body, and these sorts of things. The sacral center, the Swadhisthana chakra, is associated with sex, but also with your gender identity, with pleasure, with creativity, with a sense of play. The the navel center, or the Manipura Chakra, is associated with your personal power, with status, comparison with others, but also with digestion, food digestion, but also how you digest your experiences. And it's very much associated with like the fire element, right? So different chakras are also associated with different elements. The heart chakra is associated with love, with family, community, with your relationship to the world from a heart level, with family and needs for connection, closeness, to love and to be loved. And the throat chakra is associated with the intellect, with the mind, with your paradigms and narratives, your commentary, your ongoing commentary about life in the world. The Agya chakra, the third eye, is associated with the seat of your self-awareness. And the crown chakra is associated with your God consciousness, or your connection to the supreme source of reality, the ground of being, the universe. So you have these 7 chakras, and they're basically like organs of the mind. And they're also places where different memories are stored. That's a lot more esoteric, but each chakra has a certain number of petals, and each petal is a memory bank, and that memory bank is associated with different years in the development of your lifespan. And so when you think about that, then there are different characteristics that you want to cultivate that are connected to the health of a particular chakra. And you can assist in doing that by doing certain poses. Like, for example, for the root chakra, there are poses like Uttanasana, or standing forward bend, that helps to, it's a pose where you're standing with your feet firmly planted on the ground, and your head and your back are kind of like bent forward. And it's a great pose for easing the busy mind. It helps to stretch and strengthen your hamstrings and relieve back tension. It helps to sort of like center, focus the mind and body, and really help you to feel safe and sturdy within your own legs. And like I said before, your legs are very much associated with your sense of rootedness and groundedness in home. Another example would be like like warrior one and warrior two pose, also known as Virabhadrasana, right? So this pose is basically a pose that enables you to cultivate fearlessness and strength and determination. Your feet are firmly planted on the ground. You're developing a sense of direction in your gaze and in your focus, right? Bringing this kind of physical alignment. These poses, and poses are associated with emotions all the time. Like if you've ever noticed, when you're feeling happy, your body is your spine is upright, energy is flowing upwards, your voice is speaking more clearly, you're smiling, all of these other things. When you're feeling sad, your shoulders are slumped over, your breathing is a lot more shallow. Pose and state of consciousness go together in very powerful ways, and moving the body is a form of consciousness state training in that way, in very intentional ways, moving limbs in different directions that help to cultivate these different types of energies. Similarly, you have the sacral chakra, where whereas like the root chakra, you had a lot of standing poses that were very grounding and stabilizing. With the sacral chakra, there's a lot of like laying down poses, like the Sphinx pose, where you're laying with your sort of like belly up, belly on the ground, and your elbows and hands are holding up your upper torso and your head. Or for example, like reclining goddess pose or pigeon pose. These are hip opening poses that are also lying down. You have like the navel chakra and different poses like plank pose or boat pose. And at any rate, these are all poses where you're like holding up the body with your arms and strengthening your core. And there are also poses where you're either like twisting the spine, like Ardha Matsyendrasana, which is like half spinal twist, or Vajra which is like seated twist. And you're essentially like building your sense of strength. There are poses that require more physical strength. And in that strength, you're building your personal power, will, determination, and all these energies associated with the sacral center, with the navel center. Heart chakra is associated with very like chest opening poses, like upward facing dog, like wheel pose, cobra pose, and also moving the spine in that direction, like with cat cow pose. The throat is associated with like Sinkhasana, which is like lion's pose, or it's a pose where you're sort of seated and your tongue is out, your eyes are rolled up, and that's like a pose that really like opens the mouth and opens the channels of communication. Things like shoulder stand. There's a pose called Vipatra Karinasana, which is like you basically sit where your seat or your butt is like touching the wall and your legs are up against the wall. That's like another great pose for opening up the throat and giving you a different sense of like groundedness. The third eye is very much associated with like meditation postures like Padmasana, the various variations on lotus pose, as well as things like chair pose, thunderbolt pose, corpse pose. And similarly, the crown chakra is associated with like tree pose, with headstand, with the meditation postures, as well as with corpse pose as well. And so you're engaging this kind of body mind through doing these kind of yoga poses, and you're also relieving muscular tension. And this physical muscular tension is also associated with blocks within the flow of energy through the meridians. And within Chinese medicine as well as yoga, it's stated that like the difference between health and illness is really the capacity for life force energy to freely flow through the system. And by removing these blockages to muscular tension, which we experience as stiffness, by increasing this kind of bodily flexibility, you're allowing for energy to flow more freely through the body, which is deepening your sense of well-being and also improving your overall physical and emotional and mental health. So Hatha yoga is a really powerful practice in terms of like assisting you with building the hygiene and health and sort of like self-care of your subtle bodies, and also cultivating like awareness of it too. And I guess like I'll kind of like pass it back to Lalit if there's anything you want to like add or like sort of build on that, and then I'll go into another part of my talk on like yoga and subtle worlds.
Sure. I mean, we generally do have this idea of the 7 chakras in the body, but I'd like to also add that, you know, when you combine this with the knowledge of Chinese medicine, you know, in that philosophy, there are actually thousands of chakras or energy centers in the body, and it's almost like each pore of the body, of the skin even, has its own aperture or voltage potential, as is called in the body electric. there there's just a huge network, and I think even in some systems of yoga, it's acknowledged that there are way more than 7 chakras, and they're also located in within the greater field of the energy field. You know, above the head, below the feet, there are more chakras that we don't always hear about. So it's important to know that there's just a huge, vast network that we are able to access using the physical body as an anchor. And, you know, they're all points of not only energy flow, but also the flow of information. And, you know, distance doesn't really change the effectiveness of some of these things, which really speaks to the possibility of things like ESP and distance healing too. What else did I want to add? Yeah, there's also kind of in Chinese medicine or in Qigong theory, this idea of the central meridian or the governor's meridian being sort of this staff or pole of white light that is kind of, you know, obviously it coincides in physical location with the central nervous system and cerebrospinal fluid, but it also has to do with like the amount of virtue and strong, like high vibrational energy that you have accumulated that sort of builds up, and it can go beyond the top of your head, and it connects you to, you know, the celestial bodies or the galactic center above you, and also to the core of the earth below you. So these are kind of imagination, or, you know, not imaginations, but images of how we can perceive our place in the world, um, in relation to nature, in such a way that, you know, we're in harmony with our surroundings. We can be in harmony with ourselves, and that leads to, you know, what you were talking about last week, liberation of all in a really meaningful way. And
Yeah, totally. Yeah, just like even thinking about that, you know, the within Buddhism, so like within like Chinese Taoist kind of uh, uh, cosmology, you have these like meridians, and they're also the same meridians that dictate like pressure points and a lot of techniques around like martial arts as well. And with Zen, which is like where I first got my kind of like beginning meditation training, Zen is in many ways like this like syncretism of Mahayana Buddhism and like Taoism. So I explored a lot of other like Taoist things alongside being rooted in Mahayana Buddhism at the beginning of my meditation journey. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is that Zen was associated with like martial arts and this kind of like samurai spirituality, or this kind of like spiritual warriorship. And integrated with this concept of like warriorship, it's like not for no reason. It's very much rooted within the context of this bodhisattva's vow, of this vow of the wish to awaken as quickly as possible to assist in the liberation of all sentient beings, to attain enlightenment as quickly as possible, to be of benefit to the process of planetary enlightenment as being the root intention, the root motivation. And bodhicitta as the energy of this intention and motivation. And so it's like, as we're engaging in this process, we are engaging in a process of spiritual warriorship where on an internal level, you have like the metaphor of like the Bhagavad Gita, where it's this battlefield between the different sort of like forces of ancient Indian society. And these both represent the kind of, I guess, like quote unquote positive and negative qualities within the soul, the positive qualities that are associated with the truth and self-realization and our best qualities, and the sort of like parts that we're working on that are associated with our forgetfulness of our essential self. And there's that internal kind of thing, but also as we step out as engaged practitioners in the world, we're also combating these systems of ignorance. We're also combating these forces that are destructive and produce suffering for ourselves and others. And as we go about that process, we want to strengthen ourselves. And that also includes like energetically strengthening ourselves, strengthening our subtle bodies. So a lot of these practices are also known as things like internal martial arts, right? Where they're like ways of strengthening the sort of like body of the spiritual warrior that is engaged in this both internal and external battle against these sort of forces of ignorance, in the direction of wisdom for personal liberation and the liberation of the world. Um, and so these things go together very well in a very important way. But I also want to add that, like, in the context of like yoga too, there's like different types of yoga. Just now we were talking about hatha yoga, which is really the science of the body and movement. But you also have things like bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of like the purification of the heart, and it has a lot to do with like emotional transmutation and raising our emotional awareness until we experience what they call parabhakti, or the divine love, the, elevating our hearts to the state of samadhi in the same way that we are elevating our minds to transcend the ripples of thought into samadhi, likewise transcending the ripples of the heart into the experience of pure divine love. And that's really related to the subtle body in countless ways too. It's also related to the work of psychotherapy and sort of emotionally cleaning up and growing. But my teacher often uses the word astral body or astral world and emotional body and emotional world interchangeably. And really, like, the astral world is kind of like the emotional world. It's the world of passion and desire as well. So the purification of your emotional body, you're actually also purifying and strengthening your astral body. And unfortunately, it's like, I learned very early on in my journey that, like, when you have a lot of persistent, like, negative emotional states, that actually affects your energy body in a tangible way. And oftentimes, like, it starts to create like holes within the aura. And then what happens is that different like entities that see like that kind of energetic woundedness in the same way that like predators in the wild would see a wounded animal and they'd be like, yeah, this is dinner, right?
Yeah.
So it's very easy for like energetic entities and these other astral kind of entities to attach themselves to a compromised energy system, and that energy system being compromised by a lot of persistent negative emotional states. So emotional state training is a big part of state training, consciousness state training within meditation in general, learning to work with our emotions and also to purify our hearts over time. Connected to that is also mantra yoga. Like, a lot of bhakti yoga practices involve singing, they involve congregational chanting of certain mantras, developing devotion, and these sorts of things. And mantra is a very big part of that too within the yoga, because mantra is working with sound, and sound is vibration, and energy is also vibration. So you can use sound to change the frequency of energy and to raise energy and transform energy within the body and mind. There's also karma yoga, which is a very deep and esoteric as well as practical sort of practice, which I'll only touch on very briefly, but it has a lot to do with turning your actions into objects of meditation, taking personal inventory and evolving your decision-making process. But also it has to do more esoterically with the location of what they called karma, or the sort of actions and the results of those actions within the subtle body. That there are these kind of sonic or vibrational seeds that exist within each petal of the chakra, and that relates to basically the blueprint or the film reel that later manifests into situations within your life. And through certain esoteric initiatory yogic practices, you can begin to go into your subtle body and edit the film reel before it manifests, as it were, through the use of different mantric sounds and pranayama and all of these other techniques. So karma yoga has a lot to do with understanding the way that your actions leave impressions upon the mind, the way that you can change those impressions over time, the ways in which you can learn life lessons before harsh life experiences come your way to teach them to you, and basically learn to grow and develop and cultivate virtue along the path of attaining enlightenment for the benefit of others. And then finally, like Kriya Yoga, which is an advanced integrative initiatory practice, which I'm rooted in, that utilizes things like pranayama, dharana, dhyana practices to build the subtle body, to strengthen the subtle body, to purify the subtle body in all of its channels, to be a vehicle that can adequately express cosmic consciousness. And it's a process that happens over a long period of time, and it's at the heart of the process of awakening Kundalini up the spine, which Kundalini is seen as the vortex of evolutionary energy that lives inside of us. And awakening that Kundalini brings us along the path to enlightenment progressively, gradually over time through engaging in various yogic practices. So that really kind of concludes what I have to say about yoga and the subtle body. And then I have some things to say about the subtle world, because just like our physical body is a vehicle through which we can engage with the physical world, our subtle bodies are also vehicles through which we engage with an entire world or phenomenal space of that vibrational frequency. But before I get to that, like, I'm open to answer any questions, or if Lilith would like to add or build on that.
No, I think that's amazing. And, you know, it's so much information, I know, and I thank everyone for sticking it out, even though we're being a little bit cut and dry. But it's extremely important to kind of have the right attitude towards gaining more knowledge about this, because there's so much, and it's such a kind of wishy-washy world. But, you know, as we'll find through our practices and through the lessons we're going to do in the future, you do slowly start to build a sense of what is personally very true and resonant for you, you know, because all of our cells do resonate at a certain frequency, and, you know, the molecules of every physical object around us do as well. And so each of those particles also has an entire magnetic field around it. And so it's important to note that, like, all of these things do affect each other, and this is why vibration is such a useful framework to understand very much the underpinnings of reality. And it becomes so vast, but it has, I think, really important implications for our personal journeys and our own personal healing, because, you know, our subtle bodies are often also called light bodies. And the strengthening of that is really the filling in of all the holes with light, you know, all of those sort of points of vulnerability or ignorance that you were talking about, can be addressed and can be, you know, shown light upon. And this is something that is going to help us to move throughout the world in a much more fortified way, and you know, go to different places where, you know, each place has its own auric field, it has its own energy, and we, as people with free will, you know, have a certain amount of control and power in how we interact with those spaces, whether we want our karma to basically be entangled with these spaces or not, and how we can sort of modulate the impulses and the voltages that are occurring informationally between us and the world around us. And this is sort of the basis for it, you know, this is something, this is why also it's called in alchemy the immortal fetus, or the immortal body, because actually, like, all of this healing occurs automatically at the point, at the end of our physical lives. Like, when we eventually shed this physical body and all of the cells physically that are enclosing our consciousness, we become healed, we become light, and we actually don't have to die in order to start doing this work. And as a matter of fact, like, the more you do this work, the more autonomy you're able to have after, and this is just what a lot of different people say. I haven't actually died, so you know, I'm not saying I particularly know this, but I've done this work to a point where I have experienced astral travel, and people have reported in so many thousands of cases near-death experiences, and out-of-body experiences where they're able to use the subtle body or the light body to travel, and to do all sorts of numbers of things. So it's really interesting that, you know, there's that connection between doing this kind of work and cultivating the light body, and also sort of this idea of death, or non-death, you know, or transcending death in a way.
Yeah, totally. It's really profound that the application of like energy medicine, energy psychology, energetic spirituality, is a way of both extending the lifespan and also um, a lot of mystic kind of like folklore, mystic lore around like immortality. But there are very different levels of like what one considers immortality to be. Like immortality can be simply awakening to the unborn, awakening to your unborn awareness, which is like the absolute self that is unborn and undying, right? Um, the spark of your consciousness that's one with the cosmic consciousness that is the witness, the void, the nothingness from which the universe sprung forth at the Big Bang. That's essentially realizing the immortal self that lives within us all. There's also actual things around life extension, extension of the lifespan of the body. There's also immortality in the form of, as you were bringing up before, like creation of the immortal fetus, which is in certain Taoist alchemical practices, actually creating a type of astral embryo through the transmuted sort of like pranic and sexual energies within the subtle body, and creating this fetus and then being able to transfer your consciousness into this fetus in a way where it can communicate with the planets and chart out the astrological chart of your future life, and basically creates a vehicle for conscious reincarnation as a form of immortality. Not literally the body lives forever, but the continuity of consciousness remains unbroken across lifetimes. And so there's many different levels and applications of that. That's super interesting.
Yeah, there are also stories of people who live abnormally long lives, or like you were mentioning to me in private, like certain yogis, like such as Yogananda, after they passed, you know, their physical bodies still remained in a state of living for, you know, an absurd amount of time that it would not have happened with a normal human.
Yeah. Yeah, for 20 days after Yogananda died, his body did not decay at all. There was not a single spot, not a single speckle or discoloration, which is very, very rare. But yeah, so it's like, without going too much into the kind of details about like, how does reincarnation work? What are the different stages? You know, these things are really fleshed out very well in certain texts like the Bhagavad Gita, which is like a very popular Buddhist text, but also like the Vedas and the Garuda Purana in the Hindu tradition also explain the process of reincarnation very deeply. And I guess I'll also just touch on like a cross-cultural point where we're talking about this within the context of certain Eastern traditions, knowledge of the subtle energy world is contained within mystical traditions throughout the entire world. For example, in a lot of like indigenous cosmologies, the knowledge of subtle energy and the subtle energetic world is at the heart of a lot of belief systems within like the West African traditions. What we call life force or chi is also known as ashe. In the Western traditions, there are various occult words to describe these things. And also, I think that there is like a different cultures have different mystical kind of like funerary rites or rites of the cremation ground or rites of the cemetery, where you can direct reincarnation in like different ways, right? So some African traditions might emphasize more like connection with like the realm of the ancestors, whereas other sort of Eastern traditions might emphasize unification with the clear light and, you know, overstepping the bardo or consciously going through the bardo in order to consciously choose your next reincarnation. So there's all different types of things that one can do after consciousness exits the body and is still encased within these subtle bodies. And different cultures have developed different kind of ritual technologies for guiding that process. And again, that's like endlessly fascinating sort of occult stuff.
Very interesting. So if you do you still have more points, because I think we're getting pushed a little to
Yeah,
wrap up.
I'll just go very quickly through the yoga and subtle worlds,
Okay.
and then we can wrap up. You know, so within the yogic practices, like I said, you have what you call like yoga. A lot of yogis believe that rather than having one body, we have like 7 bodies, right? And each of these bodies are associated with a different chakra. And each of these bodies also are vehicles for moving through a specific world, right? I won't go into the Sanskrit names for these different realms, but I'll just use the physical kind of like occult or theosophical language that describes it. So you have the physical world, that is moved with the physical body, and that has the root chakra as its access point. And we don't really need to do much to be aware of the physical world, hopefully. But then you have the etheric or astral world, and that has the sacral chakra as its access point. And there are specific mantras that can be chanted into that center where that'll induce the type of like vision trance experience where you can navigate through the astral world. There's the lower and higher mental worlds, which are associated with the navel and the heart center, respectively. And these, like the lower mental world, might be considered like the upper regions of the upper frequencies of the astral plane, and the higher mental world might be considered like the causal plane. And these are, again, like I said, accessed through different mantras that can induce vision trance when applied to different chakras. There's the Buddhic world, which is the world of the higher self. The Buddhic body is kind of like the higher self body, the body of intuition, the part of you that is already all-knowing. And that's also connected to an entire realm of deities and divine beings and Buddhas and bodhisattvas and saints and angels and all of these other kind of like spiritual celestial beings. And that's its own kind of plane of reality. And then there is what they call like Devaloka, or the Pleroma in Gnosticism, or the land of the Orishas, and these other kind of concepts, the land of the immortals. And so then after that, at the third eye, you have like the Atmic body, right? The Atmic self, which is the soul, the seat and ground of your being. And I call this a world too, not because it's a place with name and form that has a location, but similar to how the physical body has its physical, etheric, lower mental, higher mental, and Buddhic counterparts, the planet also has that too. So there is the physical body of the earth, there is the astral earth, there is the lower mental earth, there is the higher mental earth. These two parts might be known as the collective unconscious of the planet, right? Then you have the Buddhic earth, right, which is kind of like the realm where the divine guardians of the planet reside, the various nature deities and rishis and divine masters and angels and all these other beings that each culture connects to different pantheons of these things. But then there's also the Atmic plane, which is to say that there's the soul of the earth itself, that the earth is like a living being with a soul, and that's kind of like the Atma. And then there's the monadic, or the crown, it's this access point, and that's essentially like the God essence of the earth, just as we have like the sort of God essence within us. And there are a lot of deep and profound implications and applications of engaging with the kind of like planetary chakra, that like planets also have chakras like individuals do. Different continents and land masses also have their sacred geographies or different energetic points. They have their own meridian systems, just like human beings do. And at certain intersections, you might have vortexes. A lot of ancient cultures built temple sites and a lot of sacred architecture and performed rituals in particular locations that were rooted and related to the energetic places within the energetic fields of the planet. And so that's also very deep and profound in a positive sense, because when you learn about this, then it gives you a new sense of understanding about like the reasons why people go on spiritual pilgrimages and why going to sacred temples and all these other things are parts of people's spiritual journeys. But there's also kind of like a negative counterpart too. Like you can use these things and go to these places for your own spiritual growth. And these things may call to you at different parts of your journey. But there's also a negative element to it too, where, how do things like war and colonization and imperialism, how do these things and extraction of minerals from the planet through violent means, how do these things also affect the energetic field of the planet? How do they affect the energetic field of that particular location? And one thing that I was just sort of thinking about as an example would be like New York City, right? Which is my favorite city in the world. I love New York. I was born and raised in New York. But like Wall Street, for example, is built on African burial ground, which is to say that it's literally built on top of the corpses of dead slaves, right? Like and that's so like visceral and physical, but also symbolic to the degree to which capitalism is the afterlife of slavery, and literally the center of world capitalism is built on the bodies of slaves. But also it's like, how does that impact the kind of like energetic field of the city, right? When you think about places like Brooklyn, I can like post resources for this if people want to look into this further, but most major Brooklyn street names are actually named after prominent slave owners in the North prior to the urbanization of Brooklyn. You know what I mean? So it's like, how does this legacy of violence manifest itself in a way where it creates an environment that can operate as an energetic trigger point for more violence, right? So people talk about certain neighborhoods have like high crime rates and things like that. And these are all very loaded terms. And there's a sociological dimension to it, but is there also an energetic like component to it too? Or these places where people come from different parts of the world that are oppressed, that are coexisting to each other on lands that were stolen through violence and in which ultra violence took place. Like, how does that also shape that too? And so that's worth thinking about, just because, you know, becoming aware of your subtle body then gives you a reason to now take care of it, to have energetic hygiene and these things through different practices. But also, this is a way of kind of like protecting yourself and enabling yourself to mitigate the disharmonizing effects of your environment may have upon you, right? Like, there's a whole science of feng shui around interior design that helps to allow like the healthy flow of energy within our environments. Most of us don't live in places or work in places that are organized along feng shui. So your workplace or your home might itself be obstructing your energy and you don't even know it. But having a practice will help you to mitigate some of those effects. Similarly, Vastu is a whole science around like connecting building architecture with the energy of the planet. Most of the buildings within our cities aren't designed that way. So there's an inherent harmonizing effect of our environments upon us. And having practices to mitigate that also helps us to cultivate well-being in a, you know, like Carl Jung once said, like, you know, it's impossible to be like totally well in like a profoundly sick world. Well, these practices also help us to cultivate more wellness than we would otherwise be able to achieve despite the sickness of the world that we live in. And so that kind of like closes what I was going to say about yoga and the subtle worlds. Thank you all for coming and listening, and I hope that this has been of benefit to you in some way.
Thank you so much, Julian. Yeah, I don't know how to top that. That's pretty much, I think, everything we wanted to hit on. So I'm gonna stop the recording. Thank you so much for being here, and let's move on to the group portion.